Hello everybody, thanks for having me here today. My name is Marvin and I'm a PhD student in science for cultural heritage at the University of Salento in Italy. And today I'm presenting on the behalf of me and my co-author, who unfortunately couldn't attend the conference, Dr. Vincenzo Cassone, who is a postdoc researcher at the Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto and a game studies expert. The aim of this presentation is to reflect on how certain game dynamics and game representations may result in an increased attitude to uncritically accept propaganda that makes pretextual use of history. To do so, we will focus on certain points related to the ludic representation of the past through gameplay and game narratives, discussing how they may facilitate certain populist forms of propaganda and how different game dynamics can instead address or contrast them. Populist and conservative movements and parties have several elements in common, and amongst them, the pretextual and distorted use of historical and archaeological arguments and narratives in their propaganda, which are used to legitimize and support extremely conservative social policies. The use of historical and archaeological elements within nationalist and identitarian propaganda is not new. One of the most known examples is represented by Mussolini's rise to the government in Italy, when the fascist government worked on different media in order to create the basis of an Italian mythology based on the image of a mythical and stereotyped ancient Rome. So this kind of rhetoric is not new. It is now applied to the contemporary new media forms of these days, video games included. There are only a limited number of games directly funded or created by political parties and movements, but the representation and gameplay dynamics of video games based on historical narratives presented in many commercial games may expose people to the populist pretextual use of historical topics in propaganda. Populist propaganda based on assumed or distorted historical narratives in the ludic medium has a potential high impact on society. For this reason, it's particularly relevant for the debate regarding all medium that could contribute in disseminating historical knowledge, video games included. On one end, it's linked to the understanding of archaeology and history that the general public develops through popular media. On the other hand, it's linked to the fact that the ludic medium may make people get closer to historical and cultural heritage topics, promoting engagement and awareness of the past in its many forms, by helping in reducing the gap between scientific community and the broader public. Over the course of the past 20 years, game studies have reflected on the socio-cultural dynamics involved in the representation or in the interaction with the past in ludic settings, highlighting two interrelated dimensions. One, many games involved in the representation of the past end up more or less explicitly reiterating colonialist, nationalist, or capitalist dynamics by means of game narratives and gameplay dynamics, as for example, focusing on exploiting resources, accumulating goods, or wars against nations. On the other hand, games have the potential of subverting and critically approach historical narrations. Interactive ludic systems can make it possible to transmit knowledge to a different audience, to a general public, in a systematic and engaging way. Before presenting the points and the games that we have analyzed, I'd like to do a few disclaimers. First of all, this presentation is only the first step in a work in progress research that we plan to develop in the following years. For this reason, Dr. Idon and I will really appreciate any suggestion, criticism, and question. They will be more than welcome. Second, while we'll present examples of different games, our aim is not to evaluate the historical accuracy of games. nor to consider them as positive or negative examples of historical gain. Our aim is to show how the interaction of gameplay, narratives, and representations, themes, and so on, may affect the ways in which the public understand the past and how this representation may contribute in shaping social and political attitudes. And last but not least, we don't want encouraging people to accept revisionist theories and narratives, but to develop a critical understanding of the use of historical and archaeological issues in political propaganda and their potential manipulation. The historical elements used in populist propaganda are characterized by a monolithic and static vision of the past and of social structures, which are proposed as universal and unchangeable. For example, refusing the idea of the current societies as the result of a long-term cultural and ethnical hybridization due to migrations, or promoting the idea that the nuclear family is historically and geographically universal. This perspective of the past is used to support the preservation or the construction of social structures seen as the direct heritage of a so-called natural order, universally recognized by all civilized human communities and unchanged over time. So the analysis will focus around three main points. The first one is the hyper-focus on single uncontextualized historical elements, events, characters, context. The second one is the exploitation of the resources as the sine qua non condition for development. And the third one is the representation of historical development as predetermined and linear. So the first point, certain games and media present historical narratives by focusing on specific events without linking them to the broader historical context. This does not only lead to an understanding of history as a collection of facts about the past, but may potentially lead to an instrumental use of those events as part of propaganda by glorifying them and isolating them from the context. Similarly, historical characters may be described by decontextualizing their actions and speeches in order to use them to legitimize contemporary political claims. For example, the Assassin's Creed series, which has been praised for its representation of places and scenes from various historical periods, often focus its main narrative around the great events, famous men, wonders, and relics of the past. On the other hand, games may portray and simulate long-term phenomena with their systematic interactions of cause effects that represent the often less visible side of historical dynamics. As for example, in the series of the Patricians, where the historical phenomenon of the Hanseatic League is simulated through a system which includes economic exchange of goods, diplomatic activities, and political dynamics. So in this broader frame, historical events are contextualized as the result of the multiple dynamics at work. The second point is the exploitation of the resources, and often strategy digital games provide only functional models of interaction with the landscape, with other human groups or the past itself, translating everything into game resources which can be looted, accumulated, and exploited. So resources end up being required for the development of the faction in a competitive perspective. These dynamics not only reiterate colonialist rhetorics, but also the populist belief of identity as owning place, people, or cultural heritage itself. As for example, in Age of Empires, as in many other historical-based strategy games, material resources are necessarily accumulated and exploited for the growth of the faction in competition with other groups. Their acquisition leads to the depletion of resources themselves and fuels conflicts with other people for their control, which is seen as inevitable and may tacitly support the belief that the winners are those who can fully exploit the resources up to their depletion or exhaustion. On the contrary, there are games that use resources, separating them from a logic of accumulation and exploitation, focusing more on the dynamic relationship between human communities and the environment. As for example, in the survival strategy game, The Dawn of Man, hunters-gatherers groups interact with a vast complex set of resources, from fish to flower to tannin. Resources may be more or less scarce depending on the environmental conditions, have different cycles, and are used first and foremost for the sustenance, not as a resource to be used against other groups. Different societies within the game may develop a different balance in the use and interaction with resources. That depends on the play style, or the environmental condition, and the specific past events, and so on. The third and the last point is the perspective of history as predetermined and linear. Certain games present the historical development of societies in terms of linear and necessary progress. This perspective is usually flattened on the rhetorics of Western scientific development, as well as on the narratives of national development as necessary conflict between nations or groups. Several games, such as Empire Earth or Age of Empires again, present the historical development of societies through a Western-centric and European-centric perspective, featuring technologies and ages as a series of linear steps necessary to reach an ever-increasing degree of civilization. This not only gives an idea of history purely based on European history, but may also confer the positivist idea of development as a linear evolution towards a better version of the present. And on the other hand, historical simulation may also represent the historical development not as an already established and necessary set of events, but as one among many possible results of a complex system of dynamics. Through the potentiality offered by showing counterfactual history, they make players explore alternative developments and so reflecting on the past as the result of the many interacting dynamics that shaped it. For example, a game as Europa Universalis is well known for its approach to simulation in terms of sandbox dynamics. Despite its Western-centered focus, it starts with a relatively accurate representation of European states in early modern age. Then the game can lead to very different historical developments on the basis of the player and computer choices during the match. With the potential counterfactual and fictional scenarios, but still coherent in terms of the historical engine of the game. The elements that contributed to the development of societies are so many and so interconnected that our history and our past is only one of the possible past and not the result of a predetermined plan and nor a deterministic condition. So to conclude, we hope to have showed how certain game dynamics and representation may expose people to the populist pretextual use of historical and archaeological elements, and how different game dynamics can instead be used to address or counter them. The three main dimensions we identified as the most critical in the construction of a critical mindset toward the topic are the hyper-focus on single uncontextualized historical elements, exploitation of the resources as sine qua non condition for the development, and the linear and predetermined representation of historical development. So we suggested how the representation of a long-term emergent phenomenon, the separation between resources and exploitation dynamics, the simulation of a non-linear historical development may provide meaningful tools for a different understanding of the past. In conclusion, we believe that besides focusing on the representation of archaeological topics or the research on new technologies for archaeological dissemination, archaeogaming could and should also reflect on how the representation of history in digital worlds may be understood and interpreted, and which usage and interpretation may result from it. As you might imagine, the stakes in this venue is quite high. So we hope to be able to develop this line of research in the future. Thanks for your attention.